time for an episode of the Thought Project, just so you know. And this will be a special edition in that it's probably going to be the last in the show's series. I've been doing it for almost a year. It started last November. And so actually it's been a full year. And I feel like the project was about a progression of thought and ideas coming up to a point, which I made in the last show. And I feel like it's time for the show series to end for a lot of reasons, but mostly because it had a specific progression of thought and experiences to go through, and relevance back to my time in the Washington, D.C. area, and then also what happened in Dubuque, Iowa, some of the incidents with Wisconsin, and, it was a project that I'd agreed with a number of people at the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, a long time ago that I would do, for myself as much as for other people. And I think it's just really important to recognize that, everything has its timing and place. And so there will be another show coming that will be called Simply Stated, but I'm not exactly sure when I'll be starting it. The YouTube channel will stay, but it's important to note that I'm really focusing on projects that actually pay me money. And during the past year, OnlyFans has taken off for me and become something that made me a small amount of income. Whereas as of yet, the YouTube channel and the Spotify podcast, despite being really well ranked and watched, right now the show podcast, the Thought Project, just so you know, is not actually bringing in any income for me. So I'm going to be having to change gears and think of something different. That doesn't mean there won't still be content on YouTube. There will. It's just everything's going to change up, and so you'll see some changes in the actual channel itself as I redo things. So, but all that said, let's get into this show. And by the way, my dog Hope is here today too as well for the show that I'm filming outside. So I think the big thing right now to note with all the different sort of, the U.S. conflict with Russia as played out through what's happening in Ukraine, and then there's also the issues with Palestine, Israel. The U.S. has got involved in the constant issue with the CCP, and then of course there's been multiple attacks from Russia and China over the past year, and we've allied with Australia and Japan to take on those threats. And I feel like I pretty successfully covered that, maybe more in depth than anyone, and covered the U.A.W. strike as well, and then also compare and contrast that with other types of quote-unquote labor union strikes from brown front groups out in Hollywood, and also front groups in Hollywood as well. So tying all that together, I think it's really important that the U.S. is actually debating about the use of lethal autonomous weapons that select targets using artificial intelligence. And this has been developed by countries including the U.S., China, Israel, and several governments are looking to restrict AI as well, but that is not part of the U.S. government's plan at this point. So it's important to note that all these other governments I've just named, China, Israel, the U.S., are very closely and happily looking at the use of AI to direct weapons at this point. And it's kind of important to know that the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, said the AI-controlled drone swarms would evade the U.S. The attempts to evade the U.S. offset China's People's Liberation Army's memorial advantage in weapons and people. I'm not really sure what she entirely meant from that entire statement, but what she's saying is that essentially the AI weapons the U.S. has created will be hoping to offset those that the Chinese are making and using, and what they've used to attack the U.S. So that's what's happening right now. It's a little different. I'm not even going to bother being worried about it with everything I've seen in my life. I think, it's just a choice. It's just a decision that's out there. And it's important for people to understand that the use of AI in weapons is coming. So, AI can be good or bad. Really. All depends on the developer. So, moving on, the U.S. government intel community, especially N.S.A, has reached into the Russian SORM system. There was a very complicated article that came out this week on that, noting several different hackers who may or may not have been working for Russia, but their use of hacking information and software, and then which was not lawful at all, and then notes within their own email accounts were noted and found by the USA. And it's important to know that the U.S. actually began intercepting SORM 1, SORM 2, and SORM 3 information systems created by the FSB, formerly known as the KGB, out of Russia about 10 years ago. So that was back in 2013. And all this was found after an investigation into a man named Jacob Applebaum and his Gmail account by the DOJ back in 2011. So even I can't keep up with all the different words and ideas I'm having to throw at you all in this show. So in depth. And I think it's important to understand about Russia as far as they go. The Russian officers have a saying written in Cyrillic on their jackets that says, "You talk, we listen." That's really true for any American in the U.S. because Russia does surveil the U.S. a lot. So what you say and you heard in audio is what they use. The rest they really can't get to. And so if it's not something that they can hear, or it's not something they can necessarily see, then it's not something they can necessarily use. But at the same time, so audio is key, basically. That said, there have definitely been situations where they have used that to their own advantage to try to send people signals and information to not talk and to try to get away with sending covert signals to people. And that's why people, you'll find a lot of Americans who are educated, or just anyone with half a brain is like, I'm not listening to that, I'm not going to pay attention to that, because I don't want to be involved with those people. So that's some of what the show has been about. One of the hackers that was working for the FSB that attacked me back in 2019, who had been fired from the N.S.A, I hope, but may not have been fired again, maybe back at it. He's definitely still working for an American consulting company that mostly serves Russia and China, and that hasn't been addressed yet. But that man very much complained, and, the sort of bizarre event that I went through, that he was angry that he couldn't simply send signals to people and make them do what he wanted. So be wary of that with Russia, that they really are active in the U.S., that their intel groups and teams are here, and they expect people to respond to those non-spoken signals, and you really don't have to. Especially as you use this, and neither does anybody else. So, and I know all that from living in the D.C. area for 19 years and talking about it with government agencies and just discussing the frustration of it and how much they just annoy everyone. And maybe that's what part of the show should have been called. It should have been called "You Annoy Everyone, Just So You Know." And none of us really care about what you want. So, when you look at Russia, and the Russian mafia in the U.S., there's no other group that violates civil rights like they do. And I even got to the point where I said, where are you all coming up with this idea from some of the feminists that it's white men causing all the problems? It's pretty clearly Russian men. It's pretty clearly Russian men that are, in some cases, illegal immigrants in the U.S. that are causing a lot of the issues with civil rights. It isn't all white men. So it isn't all men, for sure. But moving on, the Biden administration, White House, has decided to declassify intel suggesting the Wagner Group provided air defense capability to Hezbollah or Iran. And that came from the National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby. Additionally, the Wagner Group was tasked with carrying out delivery of a surface-to-air SA-22 missile system from Syria to the Iran-hacked militant group Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Hezbollah said they weren't going to get involved, but apparently that's not really true. I think it's important to note for this episode that too much negative news from Wired News says that psychologists have determined once again that there's too much negative news right now with the war in the Ukraine, Israel, and fighting Palestine. Of course, I've noticed some other issues, and it's having a detrimental effect on the American psyche again, and too many people are becoming depressed by the news. I think it's really worth noting that getting back into doing this show, I know this for myself, going through all this material, like there's so much material, I can't begin to cover it. I could make a daily show, but it's not worth it for me financially right now. And I've seen the difference when I do more shows. I don't necessarily get more subscribers. My subscribers really like my shorts. They like it when I sing. They like little mini videos. They even like the little videos I put together with music with just pictures of me. People are tired, and they got a lot to deal with. I don't know if I'm just stating the obvious, It's like College to the Thought Project, just stating the obvious. So, notably, accusations have come out against Governor Ron DeSantis from a social media personality, Laura Loomer, and they're all to be called libel. She is claiming that Governor Ron DeSantis' campaign has provided prostitutes to his campaign and using them at events to entertain donors. That's a really tricky situation, and I'll say why. Because you're going into a really nasty territory when you accuse someone of hiring prostitutes. Now, what I do know about the political world, having been involved in it, is that there's always people on campaigns or certain campaigns anyways, and certain offices on the Hill, and certain administrations that do sleep around. And to call one of those people a prostitute is just wrong, because prostitution is a very, very straightforward process of someone providing sex directly for money. And there's usually solicitation involved. So be very careful, calling someone that might just be whatever you want to call that lifestyle-wise, a prostitute. Because that really just looks so trashy and weird to go to that place when everyone knows that there's always a lot of young people in politics who are out like partying and sort of doing their thing and getting around. So it's not a nice thing to say. And it's something you need to be careful about because that's a legal term. Now, getting into economics on the U.S., Black Friday in the U.S. created a record $9.8 billion in the U.S. Early Black Friday. Sorry, I had to get my dog here. Come here. No, come here. Come on. Okay. So, created a record $9.8 billion in the U.S. for early Black Friday sales. And it's kind of important to know this because the data shows, apparently in certain parts of the country, that the stores still had customers despite smaller crowds, and this has gone on before the pandemic. And however, the major sales are still online, and it started that way before the pandemic. There was definitely more of the Black Friday, Cyber Monday transitions towards spending more online and avoiding the crowds, and that goes a lot with just crime and everything else that goes on. So that's kind of an issue that people are avoiding with Black Friday, but there still was some substantial crowds considering all those changes especially in certain major cities. So people are definitely still buying some, but there's been a restriction on that to a certain degree just based on economic factors. I had to go in through all of this as far as going back to the man I nicknamed Kendrick and the holiday agency and all that had to be discussed as part of the show. Because it was very much deemed his fault that I went through so much trafficking, and it's important to understand that I had to also alert Luther College, the people in that network, just so they all understood where they were coming from, that he very much blamed them and considered himself a victim of abuse and someone who was set up by Russians and Russian people in the U.S. and was told he could only marry Russians. And that was his excuse for a lot of his behaviors. And at the same time, you have to consider that he's someone who's lived a very opulent lifestyle, and you have to consider in my experiences and time, even at home health, there definitely are people that are predators in their younger life, and they sort of create a network of predators. When they get older, those predators turn on them. And that's one type of abuse case you'll see that, ends up having to report to APS. The other is you see people that made mistakes earlier in life and keep getting set up. And then finally, and those are ones people are most sympathetic to, that second type. And then, of course, you have people that are just plain old lying and are sociopaths or psychopaths, and they're literally just complaining because everybody in the world won't work for free so they can, jet set around the world and go to fancy parties. And you have to consider that he also has this spouse now who started out as a man that I had met 20 years ago at the school, or actually over 20 years ago, and that person had transitioned over to becoming a woman and has the fake career as a model and is lying about the country of origin she's from and has been noted by several different countries, not just the U.S., as doing intel for China. And really here just to undermine the country. And someone, and this current spouse had also gone ahead and yelled and screamed at the DOJ back in the 2010s about how she wanted drugs and tried to crash Gold Cup to harass U.S. federal employees and made the Department of Justice really angry to the point where they were just going like, who is this bee? So, the idea that he's this poor victim is really hard for anyone to buy. And I think I especially noted with his network out of Luther College, like some of the men in his own generation said, you're kidding me, he's going to blame all of us. And the guy was trafficking people from the school like crazy. I literally was thrown down a flight of stairs at one point in the D.C. area when I was living in Arlington, and he demanded I work for free afterwards, and he very much had threatened me beforehand and very much expected me to work for free afterwards. So he's blaming, Dan, Buffalo Bill, Patricia, Cersei, and Wilhelm. Like, they all turned on him eventually because he blamed all of them, and he's the one collecting the big fat paychecks. So it's kind of important to understand that, he could try and blame everybody else, but it's really unfair to blame the rest of this network when they're essentially worshiping him, and he could have done things differently by cutting them off a long time ago, and instead has continued forward and try to make money still through them and makes like hundreds of millions of dollars per year. It's very hard to be sympathetic to a person in that position. Yet, despite all of that, I definitely report him as a victim of abuse because quite possibly he is one, even if it isn't just in his mind, although most people would assume it's more that he's angry that he's been told he isn't allowed to simply have everything for free. And that he actually had to try to make do with the actual employees he has that are part of the FSB and the Russian mafia, and, that the government's decided his agency really is just a Russian front group, and maybe even Luther College's too, because Luther College has benefited a lot financially from that network of labor trafficking, and that's what had to be really known. And with all of that said, I mean, I'll be available on Instagram. I'm still on OnlyFans. I'll be doing Facebook and some other things, but it's important to understand that, I'm simply stating here that it's pretty hard to feel sorry for a person in that position, although I was more than happy to make the APS report. I just don't really see the U.S. government sort of hustling to try to get the guy out of his situation. Because it seems like he's got everything set up just the way he wants and making plenty of money off of people, and maybe is still trafficking people today because the behaviors from his so-called agency over the past year have been completely insane. And that's also, I think, why it's a good point to wrap up the show at this point, because that's where I left it. And, I got out of the trafficking myself. I got away and made a point of reporting him as an APS case and figured DHS can solve it. The U.S. government can solve it. Or at this point, Australia may end up solving it, or Japan, or South Korea, or, England. So there's plenty of organizations that are fed up with it all and more than willing to take those kind of people on. The rest of us, it's just about getting on with our lives. So, on that note, I'm going to sing you a little song for the Christmas holiday and call it a show. So, and I'm going to sing it with Hope. I'm going to sing we on behalf of her and I both. So, we wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Good tidings we bring to you and your kin. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And that's it. That was a thought project, just so you know, a project done in a year.